Capcom is gearing up for some substantial reveals in the next coming months to usher in what will be Resident Evil's 30th anniversary next year. And while most of us are eyeing that much anticipated reveal for Resident Evil 9, there were a number of substantial leaks that occurred late into 2020 that introduced us to two big Resident Evil titles that have seemed to have gone rogue over the years. Those titles being Resident Evil Outrage and Resident Evil HUNK. Now, have these titles been quietly cancelled, or is Capcom still working diligently on these two games? Today, we are diving deep into these two often forgotten Resident Evil games, going over all their leaks and rumors before hypothesizing if these games still have the chance to see the light of day in the future. We'll also be briefly highlighting the current understanding of which Resident Evil projects are in development and expected to be announced over the coming months. So suplex that like button and comment down below which Resident Evil titles you hope Capcom will announce soon. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. 2020 was a tough year, and regarding video game development, the transition to remote work proved to be quite the headache for developers. To make matters worse, Resident Evil developer Capcom suffered a massive ransomware attack that occurred late into the year, bringing to light 12 titles that Capcom had in their development pipeline that were to be released in 2021 through the end of 2024. Here is the list of games from Capcom that were part of this pipeline, and while many of these games have already released, namely Resident Evil 4 Remake, Street Fighter 6, Monster Hunter 6, officially known as Monster Hunter Wilds, and Dragon's Dogma 2, there are a few Resident Evil titles that have yet to be officially revealed, and with these titles all slated to be released before 2025, it's certainly a possibility that some of these titles may never see the light of day, or at least not surface for a while. We'll get into Capcom's statements about the leaking of its pipeline later into the video, but we just gotta state the obvious first. None of these titles that have since released that were part of Capcom's pipeline adhered to their respective release windows, with the reasoning being the restructuring and delays needed that were a result of the pandemic. With Resident Evil 4 Remake having released over 2 years ago, that leaves us with Resident Evil Outrage, Resident Evil Apocalypse, and Resident Evil HUNK still unreleased and consequently unannounced. With Resident Evil Apocalypse, known extensively through years of leaks as the next mainline entry in Resident Evil 9, that narrows things down to two titles, Resident Evil Outrage and Resident Evil HUNK. Let's first dive into Resident Evil Outrage, as this one has received by far the most extensive leaks and information throughout the years, with known series insider Dusk primarily responsible for most of this game's information. As I always say regarding leaks and rumors, take all this with a grain of salt, but going into the leaks, Outrage was planned to be released later into 2021 after the release of Resident Evil Village as another game to punctuate the series' 25th anniversary. But this one featuring third-person gameplay like the recent Resident Evil remakes and the Revelation series, and starring Rebecca Chambers as the game's protagonist. Now, Rebecca was one of the two main protagonists in 2002's Resident Evil 0, and was integral to the story in the first RE game. But as far as making major story appearances since Resident Evil 0 and RE1, Rebecca Chambers has essentially been MIA. Having Rebecca Chambers thrust back into the spotlight after more than 2 decades of absence from the games would be incredible, and it was said that this was Capcom's intention of giving the character a resurgence, but not entirely in the way that we may have expected, as according to Dusk, Capcom was thinking of changing Rebecca Chambers from being white, as was her portrayal in the earlier games, into an Asian woman for Outrage to help diversify the cast. As for the game's plot, now defunct poster on Twitter, Jesse Does Horror, posted a thread outlining a playtest of the game, where part of the game reportedly took place at a university where Rebecca Chambers was said to be investigating a new virus. Taking players through a library, a courtyard, and corridors of the school, playtesters reportedly came across a number of infected students and teachers who would use school-based weapons like scissors to attack Rebecca. Showcasing traits similar to the Magini from Resident Evil 5, these enemies were said to be incredibly aggressive, with the virus taking over their victims completely, where displays of uncontrollable rage were the name of the game here, as referenced by the game's title, Resident Evil Outrage. According to Dusk, files acquired from the Capcom breach indicated that a second name for the title was Resident Evil Revelations 3, and it was unclear what name this game would be revealed as. Slated to release on all major platforms, with the Switch having the marketing rights to the game, Japanese developer Tose was said to be primarily responsible for the development of Outrage, as Dusk mentioned that the developer, in tandem with some key people from Capcom, was responsible for the first two Revelations games. With Tose infamous for being known as a ghost developer, hardly being credited in the hundreds of games that they've helped develop since the 1980s, it's going to be really hard to know whether this Resident Evil Outrage / Revelations 3 game is still being developed or was ultimately canned a few years ago. Getting back to the leaks, nothing was said about the game from late 2021 until late 2023, when another prominent leaker, Nate the Hate, stated on his YouTube stream that Resident Evil Outrage was quietly cancelled by Capcom, and that the title was ultimately intended to be a multiplayer game on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. Resident Evil Outrage is no longer a project, Nate said on his YouTube channel during a stream in late 2023. Resident Evil Outrage also was never Resident Evil Switch. Resident Evil Outrage was a multiplayer, multi-platform game for PlayStation, Xbox, and I believe PC. Resident Evil for Switch was Revelations 3, or was supposed to be Revelations 3. The title may still be in development. The problem is it is a very elusive game. Details on it have been very difficult to come by. Nate's information on this title was the last we have heard about this game, and with the game potentially having changed over time, along with the failure that was Resident Evil Reverse, who knows what ultimately has happened to Outrage over the years. Could Outrage or Revelations 3 still be in development? Well, of course, especially if developer Tose is working on this project, as, like both Dusk and Nate have stated, getting more info on this game has been incredibly difficult, but for the time being, we can consider this game potentially existing as a mere possibility with some potential to see it emerge later down the road. Regardless, a Revelations 3 or an entirely unnumbered game with a name like Outrage featuring Rebecca Chambers as its protagonist would be incredibly refreshing, and I would love to see this game or something like it surface in the future. But let me know your thoughts on Resident Evil Outrage in the comments, and if you hope to see a game like this in the future. Returning to the 2020 leaks, the only Resident Evil game left to discuss is Resident Evil HUNK, and well, what's more to say about this one? Definitely sounds like this game is slated to be a game surrounding HUNK, one of the most pivotal characters in all of Resident Evil, who played a big role in the Raccoon City incident and debuted in Resident Evil 2. A game about HUNK would definitely be compelling, but his brevity in the series is also one of the reasons why this legendary Umbrella security service Alpha Team commander is so popular. Regardless, we can't go wrong with more HUNK, and with no leaks or leads for this game, unfortunately, we can either say this game is several years away from being released or has been quietly put to rest. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you think we'll see this game get the light of day, and if you'd like to see HUNK get his own game. I understand that his big appeal is his mysterious and badass aura about him, and that perhaps an entire Resident Evil game dedicated to this fan favorite may be a bit too much, but if you ask me, I'd be down to see this game happen. According to the 2020 leaks, this game was aimed for a Q4 2024 release date, so if this one is still being worked on, I'd imagine this one dropping a few years down the road. Alright, so with both Outrage and HUNK being explored, let's return to the Capcom leaks, as we have seen a fair number of these games released that were part of the company's pipeline. As for whether the leaks had any impact on Capcom's development, Capcom reported in early February 2021 during Capcom's fiscal year 2020 third quarter earnings presentation that the cyber attack had, quote, no significant impact on the releases and that the development has, quote, largely returned to normal, end quote, as reported by IGN. What this means for the unannounced RE games on this leaked content pipeline remains to be seen, but only time will tell here if both the Outrage and HUNK titles will see the light of day. There really is no way to know, but seeing as Capcom will be celebrating Resident Evil's 30th anniversary next year, it would be incredible if we see these games get announced, even though I think it would be pretty unlikely. One can hope though, right? This brings us to what the current discourse is regarding future Resident Evil games, with RE9 leading the pack as the next likely game to get revealed ahead of the series' 30th anniversary. With Dusk also heavily touting a Resident Evil 0 remake, along with a Code Veronica remake releasing later, that's essentially 3 Resident Evil titles right there that have a chance of being announced relatively soon. And with Dusk earlier in 2024 stating that Capcom is working on upwards of 5 RE games, that leaves many speculating which other 2 games the developer could be working on. I mean, we just went over RE Outrage and RE HUNK, and while I'd love to see these games get announced soon, I can't confidently say that any of these 2 games may be the next likely titles to be announced should Capcom actually be working on 5 Resident Evil games currently. Another remake of Resident Evil 1 has also seen leaks and information over the years, so I mean, it's impossible to really tell what's going on at Capcom behind the scenes. But share with me your thoughts in the comments, what you think of all these games we discussed, and what you hope to see announced for Resident Evil's 30th anniversary next year. In fact, I've got just the video for you if you are curious about just that, so come find me over here where we will discuss my predictions about Resident Evil's upcoming games to launch during its 30th anniversary. That's all I have for you in this one, my friends. I'll see you all real soon in the next video.